My question is about, which I mentioned to you earlier, transitioning from writing your own poems into translating someone else's work. In this case, prose, although there are at least one poem, maybe a couple poems in here that you translated from the French, a poem for Apollinaire, I remember, and maybe another. This is a question which I asked Peter Cole when he was here also, who has a really different trajectory, who really started as a translator and then became a poet. I think, to my knowledge, you started as a poet and then became interested in translation later on. Could you talk to that a little?
Sure. I'm just an amateur translator. I've translated a handful of things in my life, inspired by Ron Padgett, who contributed the afterword to the book. And I was in a workshop of his during college, actually. I would drive down to New York, and he found out I was taking a lot of French, and he said, why don't you try translating? It never occurred to me to translate something for fun. It was always a job you had to do at school, and it turned out to be a lot of fun. And this is the only sustained piece. I did a Valérie Larbaud essay called The Hamlet of the Bees years ago, but this is only a book-length thing I ever translated. I'm going to refer to the great Lydia Davis, who's a real translator and a real writer, who I understand is coming here shortly. And she recently published a piece in the New York Review of Books, I think before Christmas, a few weeks, on 11 pleasures of translating. And there's nothing I can say better than what she said, but one of the greatest pleasures is that you don't have to be in a good mood to do it. You don't have to be the least bit inspired or feeling any connection with any muse. You just have to sit down and do it, assuming you know something of each language. And that is just a wonderful thing for a writer to have available, because I don't know about you, but I can't always get my own writing done. What she says is you have the pleasure of working with all the parts of writing. You have this writing pleasure within the island of the given text, within its distinct perimeter. You are not beset by that very uncomfortable anxiety, the anxiety of invention, the commitment to invent a piece of work yourself, one that may succeed but may also fail, and whose success or failure is unpredictable. So that's a huge pleasure in itself. And then she goes on to talk about all the other wonderful things, that essentially you're working a puzzle. But it's a much better puzzle than anything you can find in the newspaper. Much more creative and involves a lot of imagination, and that every word is a creative act, as well as a complete compromise and a disloyalty to the original, because the words are never the same in the other language. But that's just a few of the things that she talks about, and what has made this such a pleasure for me to have as a project.
Any questions from out there, the wild out there? I can keep going, but perfect. Can we pass the mic over there?
As a layman and starting from a point zero knowledge of Suppot, aside from your book, what would you recommend as a starting point to get into it, poetry and prose?
For prose, I would recommend the memoir that he wrote after the experience of 6 months in prison in Tunis. It's called Age of Assassins, borrowed from Rimbaud. And I just read it. It's available in English, not in print, but you can find it used. And it's amazing. He takes you to the mind of what it's like to be a prisoner, imprisoned as a dissident, but a prisoner. And we've all read prison literature. This is one of the best. I mean, many of the writers aren't quite as articulate as he is. It's just a terrific book, and I don't have the quotes with me right now, but it's harrowing in the introduction what he says about the Vichy bullies and the mediocre intellects that are attracted to the mediocre people in power, and the grasping after power that ends up sending him to prison, and is so consonant with everything we're going through here now. So it's a fantastic book. I don't have a good poetry recommendation for you, but I'll think about it. As I say, there's some anthologies. The Paul Auster anthology of 20th century French literature has a number of good Suppot poems. Does anybody else have a favorite Suppot book of poems? There are not that many in English. Last Nights in Paris, the novel that Williams translated, it's pretty great if you like surrealism. I hate to say this, but people have criticized Williams's translation as a little wooden. I'm not sure if it's true. I haven't compared it, but it's
William
worth
Carlos.
reading. William Carlos Williams, or as they say in the film Patterson, which you should all go see, Carlo Williams Carlos.
Alan, it's such an honor for us to have you visit us. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, it's such a pleasure for me.
When you read The New Sentience and you were sitting 5 feet from Ron, this made a perfect convergence. So this is not really a silly question. Look back on all the years of your writing. At least one of the pieces you read, it may have been the New Sentience, consisted of new sentences, more or less. Yeah. So my question is, how do we get from the new sentence to the new sentience? What kind of journey has it been? Ron will get the mic next, actually, to comment.
Yeah, I'm going to need some confirmation or what. You know, I said the other night, in fact, I'm described as associated with the San Francisco group of language poets, but I always say I've had one foot in the language school and one foot in the New York school. And I plant them apart, and then I say, when that boat leaves the dock, you know what happens to me. I mean, the new sentence often gets torqued in a way that my sentences don't always torque. I would say that's a distinction to some extent. I'm not sure that I write classical new sentences, but I'll leave it to the judge here. I write short fragments, and my torques and twists appear more between my fragments, I think, than within sentences. And that may distinguish me from... And I've written mostly in verse, in lyrical form, and not in prose, which more practitioners of new sentences have done. I've done a little, but not really very much compared to many of... Certainly, that's true. But you know, compared to Ron and Barrett Watton and others, Barrett writes in verse as well. I don't know, Ron, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking Ray Armantrout is, writes short lyrical. She wrote a piece this week that I told her was very Sid Corman-esque. And we had a discussion about what that would mean in the 21st century. One of the things that I really found interesting about your discussion at the beginning was your noting the particular background of these poets, and knowing that you are yourself the son of a doctor, and that having grown up in New York City is the closest thing one can have in the U.S. to having grown up in a Parisian region in that sense, and you have been at the far end of the continent for 40-odd years. And I'm curious as to what that sense of place has done for you in those terms, particularly since you began by reading Senator Ars, who actually supported himself as a travel writer, and who Ron Padgett once translated his book Kodak, which he was unable to get published because a certain large American corporation really didn't understand its relationship to great art.
I did grow up in New York, and my father was actually a scientist, not a doctor, but his name was Dr. Bernheimer. And I did, certainly in my teenage years and formative early 20s, go through experience of a country convulsed by war, in this case the Vietnam War, and I certainly rebelled. And I felt as a rebel that I was a rebellious writer as well. I was certainly rebelling against the academic writing that I had been exposed to through all of my education. So in that sense, I think there is a good parallel there. I actually became eventually to be on very good terms with my parents. I don't know that ever happened to Suppot. And I think he did support himself, as best I can tell, through his journalism and his writing. He may have inherited some money for his folks. I supported myself working in the high-tech industry, where, in fact, Ron and I worked together for one of those companies. Have I answered your question, or have I just danced around it for a minute?
You've moved in the general.
Okay. But I did have the sense that I was certainly, getting back to rebellious. Suppot's been described as a sort of a rebel, but a very generous rebel. Ron Padgett says in the afterword that his personality comes across so well in the book. He's such a likable guy that it was no wonder that he the thorny fellows that he was around, like Sandrars and like Reverdy, preferred his company to that of his fellow musketeers, Breton, Aragon, who were, I'm sure, less easy to be around. So I definitely felt like I was going against the grain in the writing that I proposed to do, originally influenced by the New York poets, who were, at the time, certainly the most anti-academic group that I knew about, that were writing something that was interesting, and then following on that with our friends in San Francisco, who at the time were anti-academic, although they had academic careers in the future, which we didn't know.
I think we have time for one last question. Everybody's got a question, raise your hand.
Two.
All right, let's send it to Adam, because I think he had his hand up for a while.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I just had a question kind of relating to Breton and
Yeah.
Suppot. Why do you think someone like Breton, who you were in talking there, he's a little bit more prickly, a little
Yeah.
less congenial as
mhm.
Suppot, sort of has come to and has overshadowed as sort of like the spearhead versus someone where you were reading there and I was mesmerized at the how he saw people and how he these people who we now, like Proust, who we understand is this sort of monumental figure, and how he sort of breaks him down into pieces that are easier to digest and easier to understand. Why has someone like Breton overshadowed him? And
Well, Breton really led a movement. I mean, he's been called the Pope of Surrealism, and Suppot got kicked out, and Breton made it his business to champion this movement for a long, long period of time. And Suppot, to some extent, though he loves Dada and Surrealism and Rebellion, he didn't make it his life, and Breton did, and he gets credit for that. And there are many people who like Suppot, as I do, just fine. In fact, Paul Auster, maybe, who wrote a blurb for me, said, He's really a minor poet, but he's a wonderful minor poet. Breton gets more marks for being in the thick of things. So nobody asked me this, but I'm going to throw it in anyway as an answer to an unanswered question. It's how did I actually come upon this book to translate it? So I know it's in the back of your minds. I was reading the wonderful book by Roger Shattuck, The Banquet Years. Do you all know it? Right? Yes. Yeah, some of you don't. It's a story, the history of the roots of the French avant-garde in the period before this, just around the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, through analysis of the lives and work of four remarkable people, including Apollinaire and Alfred Jarry, Eric Satie, the composer, and Henri Rousseau Le Douanier, who's profiled in here as well. And I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Shattuck is equally a master of understanding, criticizing literature, art, music, painting. It's amazing. Anyway, he's talking about Henri Rousseau, and of the painter, he says, Rousseau did not mind living in one room because when he woke up in the morning, he could smile a little at his paintings. And then he would get up and go to the corner cafe for his breakfast. If the weather was nice, he had a glass of white wine. If it was raining, a cup of coffee. And on a gray day, some cognac. Well, I was floored by that. I mean, I'm a Francophile to start with. The idea of the liquid breakfast sounded pretty good. I just wanted to know more about this. I wanted more stories like that. And the bibliography led me to the Suppot book.